Item of business is a statement by Michael Russell on internal market update. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, the UK Government's internal market bill that was published yesterday represents the biggest threat to devolution that Scotland has seen since this Parliament was reconvened in 1999 after 292 years of adjournment. That threat comes from a gang of hard right-wing, anti-devolution Tory Brexiteers who said during the Brexit referendum, in which the people of Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU, that they wanted to take back control. And now we know what they wanted to control: us, our country of Scotland, and our right to make our own decisions and choose our own future. They're trying to do so by removing from the people of Scotland and this Parliament the powers which were given to it 23 years ago this coming week by an overwhelming vote of our fellow citizens. But that popular mandate, Presiding Officer, means that it is the duty of every member elected by Scotland to stop them. That is not just the view of this SNP government. Here is what the Welsh Labour government have said about this bill. The UK government plans to sacrifice the future of the Union by stealing powers from the devolved administrations. It is an attack on democracy and an affront to the people of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland who have voted in favour of devolution on numerous occasions. Last month, this Parliament considered the original proposals set out in the UK Government White Paper on the internal market and voted by 92 votes to 31 to reject them. Now we know precisely what these proposals are in legislative terms and what they actually mean for businesses, for jobs, for the lives of the ordinary citizens of Scotland and for their Parliament. But this bill also had something added to it, which was not in the consultation, brief as that was. On Monday, it was merely a press rumour, but now we know that the UK ministers intend to unilaterally alter and override solemn and binding commitments in an international treaty agreed by the House of Commons only in January this year. And on Tuesday, we witnessed something I don't think anyone in this chamber would have thought possible. A UK Secretary of State standing at the Westminster dispatch box, calmly informing the House of Commons that the government intends, with this bill, to break international law. Presiding Officer, the rule of law is the cornerstone of a functioning democracy. Without it, a state is nothing but a collection of desperadoes, set on whatever aim they choose, without restraint, and no matter the consequences. Moreover, as the Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland, Sir Declan Morgan, pointed out yesterday, such actions also undermine the domestic legal scene. As he put it, where there is an indication that a state intends to break international law, it may have a domestic effect on the confidence that the public may have in the legal system generally. So Johnson's reckless actions are now aimed not just at us, but they will also trash the UK's already tarnished international standing, put at grave risk sustainable and beneficial trading and economic relationships with most of the world, and weaken the legal basis of all our lives. And all that whilst he and his irresponsible and reckless government are hurtling in the midst of a pandemic and the worst global recession in many generations towards a hard EU transition deadline of the 31st December, a deadline entirely of its own choosing, with only two bad options left: a disastrous no deal or an almost equally damaging low deal, and armed only with blockheaded arrogance, a false sense of exceptionalism, and this entirely unnecessary and deeply damaging bill, which will actually make every problem worse. For the UK government has not only signalled its intention to break international law, it is also signalling its intention to break domestic law, to break the devolution settlement, which was once described as the settled will of the Scottish people. Presiding Officer, let me now turn to the detail of the bill. There is much in it that repays study, if only to reveal how contemptuous the Tories are of this place and of the people we represent. At clauses 2 to 9, there are sweeping powers to compel Scotland to accept lower standards set elsewhere in the UK on animal welfare, food safety, environmental protections, and a host of other areas. These powers would radically undermine the ability of this Parliament to serve the people who elected it. At clause 46, powers are given to UK government ministers to design and impose replacements for EU spending programmes in devolved areas such as infrastructure, economic development, culture and sport, education and training, or possibly more general public spending in those areas. Bypassing democratically elected MSPs and ministers in Scotland, these jeopardise current Barnett funding levels and will inevitably lead to policy confusion. But worse, given the centralising ambitions of the UK government, no one should be surprised if in the future they divert money that should be under the control of this Parliament for Scotland's schools and Scotland's hospitals to pay for what appears to be their priority of Union Jack badged projects. They are already limbering up, as we saw on Twitter last night, to spend money taken from other Scottish budgets on their own pet projects in the very few Tory constituencies left in Scotland. At Part 4, the bill establishes a new unelected monitoring body called the Office of the Internal Market, which will have the power to pass judgment on devolved laws and invite businesses with deep pockets to challenge the democratic decisions of this Parliament. And Clause 48 reserves state aid, which is indisputably and without any pretence to the contrary, a blatant power grab. As we also know, as a result of the decision sneaked out yesterday in the midst of this bill chaos, the state aid provisions will merely mirror those of the WTO, making a deal with the EU even more difficult and provide little or no scrutiny or rigour. Presiding Officer, the UK Government says the bill will guarantee companies can trade unhindered in every part of the UK. That is not what this is about. There is no threat to such trade and never has been. This government endorses the need for such trade and will always do so. What they want is something different. In order to deliver bad trade deals, which is all they can expect from their weakened state, they want private health companies to have a guaranteed right to trade unhindered in Scotland, weakening and undermining the Scottish NHS. They want private water companies to be given a guaranteed right to trade unhindered in Scotland, undermining standards and raising prices. And they want, once their hooks are in, to be able to alter anything we do with just a flourish of a UK minister's pen. Because although the bill says that there may be exclusions from the principles of non-discrimination, the explanatory notes to the bill say that the bill will provide the base Secretary of State with the power to alter these exclusions to retain flexibility for the internal market system in response to changes in market conditions. In other words, Presiding Officer, the UK Government can alter whatever we do, whenever it likes, regardless of the views of the people of Scotland. That is the open door to the kind of creeping privatisation and rampant deregulation that we have already seen south of the border. Yet all the while, they behave as if our heads button up the back, insulting our intelligence with the claim that this is in fact a power surge. That is only true in the sense that power surges destroy everything they touch. In reality, it is nothing of the sort. Every one of the powers they trumpet is already devolved, already exercised, in the context of a coherent set of agreed EU laws and institutions that guarantee flexibility and local autonomy. Contrast that with the system this bill wishes to put in place, a system in which the UK Government can unilaterally and arbitrarily impose its rules on Scotland regardless of the wishes of this Parliament. In the face of widespread stakeholder concern at these proposals, UK ministers have resorted to the familiar tactic of ignoring or blatantly misrepresenting the facts. But facts are chills that one a ding, as Burns observed. Organisations, farming, business, public health, environmental and many others across Scotland and the UK are deeply concerned at these proposals. They are seen widely and correctly as incompatible with devolution, bad for businesses and the consumers, dangerous for the environment, and an impediment to necessary and effective devolved public health measures. And they threaten to undermine the good progress made on common frameworks, the preferred, proportionate and agreed means of managing policy difference across the UK when EU rules no longer apply. Presiding Officer, it's late in the day for sense to prevail in the Johnson government, but there's still just time if they commit now to that agreed process. For my part, I repeat the undertaking I made in the Parliament on the 18th of August that we will not diverge in any frameworks area, existing or new, whilst these are finalised, and urge the UK Government to do the same. This bill is actually a shabby blueprint for a much weakened constitutional settlement that would leave Scotland defenceless. It is, as the First Minister said yesterday, an assault on devolution, the like of which we have not experienced since the Scottish Parliament was established. We cannot and we will not allow that to happen. The UK Government have now asked this Parliament for legislative consent for this bill. But in addition to the damage it will do, reason enough to refuse consent, it surely cannot be right that we are expected to agree to something that is, in the admission of the proposers themselves, against international law. The Scottish Government will therefore bring to this chamber a motion to refuse consent. We will also publish a full rebuttal of the bill, which we will distribute nationally and internationally. And we will take whatever other steps are necessary to defend what we have and what we need to retain in order to build for the future. Presiding Officer, it will be no surprise to anyone that the Scottish Government remains of the firm belief that the people of Scotland have the right to choose their own future, and we are determined to make that happen. After the events of this week, that resolve is steadier than ever. That is why, before the end of this Parliament, we will set out the terms of a future referendum clearly and unambiguously to the people of Scotland in a draft bill. But even if you don't believe, even after all this, that our interests as a nation would be better served as a full, normal EU member state, no member of this Parliament, of any constitutional or political persuasion, will, I hope, consent to a bill that offends international law whilst also breaking and discarding the established constitutional settlement. If any member does vote for that, then what they are voting for is not just Tory illegality, it is in fact the end of devolution. That is what is at stake here. That is what we must all defend with every skill we have, with every ounce of determination we can summon, and with a steely resolve never, never to be defeated.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we will move on to the next item of business. It would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak buttons now. And I call Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I simply don't have enough time to address the political bluster that was the Cabinet Secretary's statement. In the middle of the current health and economic crisis, the absolute priority of the Scottish Government must be to protect jobs and livelihoods. The Cabinet Secretary is well aware, but he won't acknowledge that more than 500,000 jobs in Scotland and more than 60% of our trade depend on free access to the UK internal market. Jobs and livelihoods must be the absolute priority, not another constitutional standoff contrived by the SNP. The Cabinet Secretary claims that the internal market proposals undermine devolution, but the reality is that over 100 new powers are coming to this Parliament, making it more powerful than ever. I have 3 questions for the Cabinet Secretary. First, is it SNP policy to hand back to the EU every single one of those additional powers? Second, is it SNP policy to blindly keep pace with future EU law without having any influence whatsoever on those provisions, bypassing this Parliament and turning it into a passive rule-taker? Third, is it SNP policy? Third, is it SNP policy to return Scotland's fisheries to the common fisheries policy? And was this the reason the Scottish Government interfered in the Brexit negotiations, thereby undermining the best outcome for our fishing communities? Presiding Officer, these questions are more important than ever, because it is now clear the SNP wants to take a wrecking ball to the UK internal market, regardless of how many jobs will be lost. It is, after all, a market they want to separate from. They want to hand back powers to Brussels, and in doing so, damage Scotland's farming and fishing communities and any prospect of a full economic recovery.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, for a Tory this week of any week to talk about constitutional abstraction is frankly ludicrous. The 3 questions he poses, let me answer all of them very simply. Answer the first one is no. Answer the second one is no. Answer the third one is we have never supported an unreformed common fisheries policy, unlike the Conservatives, who not only supported it, they actually implemented that policy. But now, let me now address the points that the member would not make, and I'll make 3 of them. The first of them is this: there is no threat to the internal market, no threat at all. This is manufactured, and it's manufactured as a constitutional abstraction, his own words, in order to damage this Parliament. And I now ask him 2 questions. First of all, as a member of this Parliament, is he going to vote for the destruction of this Parliament? Because if he is, let the Tory voters note that. But the second one, and this is much more direct, as a lawyer, is he prepared to recommend to this Parliament supporting a breach of law, a flagrant breach of law? Because if he is, he stands with a number of other Tory lawyers, but he stands in contradiction both to his profession and his oath.
I now call Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, I have had regular contact with the Cabinet Secretary over this COVID period. and I've privately thought to myself that he is putting in a hard shift. It is rather ironic, therefore, that what brings us to the Chamber today is Boris Johnson's less hard-working approach, which now sees him playing fast and loose with the UK Union. It is difficult to believe that the Scottish Tories in this Parliament are willing to put Johnson and the interests of Johnson before the interests of the people of Scotland. My view is that by working together, the devolved government must now show that Boris Johnson and his Tory cabal cannot bypass the agreed devolution settlements. Indeed, we should also link up with the regions across England to build that campaign. What representations has the government made with the other devolved administrations of the UK on the Internal Market Bill? And is the Scottish Government willing to hold further discussions with the devolved administrations to show a united front against this bill and build a united campaign against this unacceptable behaviour which threatens, not just undermines, but threatens devolution?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Alec Rowley for those points? Of course, I'm willing to make common cause with anybody who's opposed this bill. I think he knows that I keep in close touch with the Labour administration in Wales, and indeed have been in touch with Jeremy Miles, my opposite number in Wales today, and will speak to him again tomorrow morning. I note Mark Drakeford's comments on this, and Mark Drakeford was Jeremy Miles' predecessor, and we work very closely together on these issues. But he does make a very good point about the need for solidarity. And I'm glad to say, because there's nobody that is out with redemption, I'm glad to say that, for example, in Wales, the Shadow Consul General has resigned from the Welsh front bench because he cannot stomach this illegality and this bill. And we've actually seen today a former Tory MEP, Stuart Stevenson, a man of principle, express his concern that this is taking place. And it is pretty shameful that there's not a single Tory sitting in this chamber who's going to rise to his feet to say, we will not have this illegality. That is the problem with the Scottish Tories, and the voters will tell them that next year.
Call Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Maurice Golden.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This bill does propose the most substantial threat to devolution since 1999, centralising control in the UK Government and also the hands of the UK Parliament, and also cutting across devolved powers by imposing new domestic constraints. People in Scotland voted decisively by 74% for these powers to come to Scotland and come to this Parliament. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that in progressing with this bill, the UK Government is rolling back on devolution without the consent of the population of Scotland?
Michael Russell.
There can be no other conclusion if you read the bill. That is entirely what they intend to do. And I don't claim to be greatly prescient in politics, but over a year ago, when we withdrew from the discussions on the so-called single market, at that stage they were calling it the United Kingdom, we knew that this was an inevitability, this is where they were going, and we needed to mark that by saying we are not going with you on this matter. Now, what I regard as really very strange is that in the midst of a pandemic, when we are facing and are in the worst recession, certainly in 100 years and probably more, when the UK government has refused the extension to the current negotiations that they were offered, they should still be bringing this forward. It can only either be monumental stupidity or a monumental dislike bordering on hatred for the existence of devolution. And if you are a Brexiteer who regards the Westminster sovereign in that medieval concept, which is still clung to by the Tories amongst others, if you regard Westminster sovereign, you thoroughly dislike the devolved administrations and the devolved parliaments, and you would like to get rid of them. That is the agenda, I have to say, and that agenda will be resisted, I hope, by every member of this Parliament who is thinking of their constituents.
Maurice Golden, to be followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Whilst recognising the SNP are a nationalist and populist government, does the Cabinet Secretary think the use of hyperbole and threatening behaviour including a reference to Ragman's role, is representative of a modern and progressive government?
Cabinet Secretary.
If I could just correct Mr Golding for a moment, this government is not populist, it is popular. You know, and that is a substantial difference from what the Tories are. I made it absolutely clear that, you know, on occasion on Twitter we all say a bit more than we should do. And I said at the time, although my knowledge of history is such, as Mr Golding's isn't, that there was hope for those on the Ragman's roll, some of whom changed their position. But I thought it was inappropriate, and I said at the time. But do you know what is even more inappropriate? Is to accuse me, for the party of which Mr Golding is a member, to accuse me of treachery this week. And in actual fact, not a single member of that party demurred from that word. Not a single member of the party demurred from that word. So I will take no lessons from the Conservatives in the language you use. The lessons I will take is from myself and my own conscience. And when I don't do things as well as I might do, I say that. I wish the Tories would.
Thank you very much. I remind all members of the need for the debate to be heard by the official report and recorded, and therefore, while it's inevitable on such an issue that tempers will rise, please do that within the bounds of parliamentary rules. I call Ruth Maguire to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Presiding Officer, Scottish Environmental Link has warned UK Government plans could force Scotland to follow lowest common denominator, especially where countries negotiating trade deals with the UK demand lower standards. Does the Cabinet Secretary share their concern that this could undermine efforts to combat climate change and biodiversity decline?
Cabinet Secretary.
I noticed the comments of Scottish Environment Link to the original consultation, which of course was only a month long, and I think they continue to be right about these matters. I noticed that Mr Lockhart upbraided me for wishing to keep pace with European regulation. There are many organisations in Scotland, like Environment Link, who are very glad that there is a government which is prepared to look at the high standards of environmental regulation else in the European Union and determined to be part of them. Because, unfortunately, we know precisely what will happen with the Tory commitment to high standards. It will evaporate. It will evaporate the moment they have the power to move on without restriction. And, as I said in my speech, these desperados will do it. And, therefore, we need to stand up. We are in a climate emergency. We need to stand up for the type of regulation we need, an even stronger regulation, and we need to reject those who are against it. I have to say I do not trust a word the Tories say, well, actually on anything, but mostly on the environment at this stage. And in those circumstances, I believe that Scottish Environment Link are right, and we will work with them to make sure that we can keep pace.
Pauline McNeill to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that not only does this bill breach international law, allowing for the contravention of their own withdrawal agreement in Article 4, but it lays the ground for more extensive breaches of international law and also tries to insulate their own ministers from judicial scrutiny? Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that this isolationist and embarrassing bill is embarrassing for the UK internationally, and would the Cabinet Secretary finally accept from me, as Scottish Labour, we are not nationalists, you know that, but yet would you accept that we will stand with the nationalists and anybody else who wants to defend the devolution settlement against the incredulous position of the Scottish Tories, who don't seem at any point to ever want to defend the devolution settlement in this chamber?
I accept that Pauline McNeill is not a nationalist. I've had that point brought home to me on many occasions by Pauline McNeill since we both entered this Parliament in 1999. But I do know that she is committed to devolution, and I know she's been committed to devolution before this Parliament even existed. So we will work with Pauline McNeill, with the Labour Party, and with any other party or individual that wishes to defend devolution. I am not a devolutionist. I wish to move on. But the reason I have been able, and the Scottish Government has been able to work so constructively and well with the Welsh Labour Government, is that we recognise that difference. We recognise that we have different final destinations. But we know that all of those destinations lie through our respective parliaments, through the work that those parliaments do and the work they do for the people of Scotland, because that is what these parliaments are about. These parliaments are about working for the people of Scotland in areas such as health and education. And it is absolutely astonishing that the Scottish Conservatives wish to conspire with those. Well, indeed, they wish to be amongst those who want to see this Parliament done down, not for the Parliament's sake, but they want to see this Parliament done down in a way that will damage the people of Scotland. I won't let that happen, and I know that Pauline McNeill won't either.
Mark Ruskell, to be followed by Alex Colham.
The UK Internal Market Bill is not statecraft, it's state-sponsored vandalism. But in rejecting this race to the bottom in standards, while strengthening the case for independence, the Scottish Government must be consistent. The race to establish free ports in Dundee and Rosyth, being championed by SNP councils and MPs, is part of the very same deregulatory agenda to cut rights and standards for workers and the environment in this bill. Will the Scottish Government rule out free ports and rule in regional Green New Deals that can deliver the right opportunities for trade and investment?
Cabinet Secretary.
Exist across the EU, and that's the point I would make. There's nothing, as far as I can see it, that the UK government is offering that is not already available in the EU and that it should be regulated. I can certainly support the member by making the point that I want to see any developments take place in Scotland on the basis of absolute commitment to the principles of ensuring a sustainable environmental future, both for those and for the country. So I think we could make common cause on that, as we need to make common cause with the Green Party as we move forward on this issue, because I know the Green Party will want to campaign vigorously alongside the rest of us to make sure that these proposals do not take place and do not succeed.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Gillian Martin.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. The scandal of the Northern Ireland situation has already been condemned by 2 of the past 4 Conservative Prime Ministers. The bill risks food safety across the UK. It is financially wasteful in the way that it allows contradictory government investment in infrastructure. It even risks harming the ability to have warmer homes in Scotland by removing separate building regulations. I want to see changes that involve the 4 governments of the UK working together. Scottish ministers have been reluctant up to now to sign up to ideas that are federal in nature. That's because they are as reluctant to share decision-making as the UK is. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, would he join a revised process with all 4 administrations to oversee the internal market?
Cabinet Secretary.
Each administration has the right to pass legislation of its own. That is the right. That's why I might suggest to Mr Cole-Hamilton he's in this Parliament, because he has the right to do that. Now, I am happy to work with the other administrations on the basis of equality. He might think that federalism is that, I think that independence is that. But I am prepared to commit myself to the equality of the 4 parliaments. And unfortunately, the one party in this chamber, I believe, because I don't think the Liberals are in this position, the one party in this Parliament that is not prepared to commit itself to the equality of those parliaments is the Conservative Party. If then all the other parties can commit themselves and commit themselves strongly and publicly to that principle of equality, that principle of equity, then we'll be able to work together to defeat these proposals.
Thank you very much. Gillian Martin, to be followed by Oliver Mandel.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I did take a bit of a breath when I heard that Dean Lockhart used the word wrecking ball, because yesterday the Guardian editorial described the Internal Market Bill as a wrecking ball swinging wildly into EU negotiations, our international reputation and the Union. And the appearance of this bill has also prompted many to warn that it will encourage a race to the bottom in terms of environmental protections, food standards and animal welfare. Does the Cabinet Secretary believe that enacting this bill could leave Scottish farmers at a financial disadvantage as they rightly try to maintain the sort of high standards in food production that has led to Scottish food having the excellent international reputation it does? And in short, is the wrecking ball called the Internal Market Bill about to devastate Scottish agriculture?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I think it is significant that the National Farmers Union for Scotland indicated in their submission under the consultation on the internal market very, very clearly, so clearly that Peter Chapman could not stomach it and was denouncing it, that they indicated very, very clearly that what they wanted to see was the frameworks to succeed and devolution to succeed. And neither of those things have been respected by the UK government in this bill. So I think Scottish farmers are right to be very, very concerned. I think Scottish farmers will find a whole era of unfair competition lies ahead if this bill goes through, and a dumbing down of standards in a way that will be very damaging for what the high standards of what they produce. But that applies right across the board. In every area of Scottish life, there will be unfair competition as a result of this bill, and it will be brought in by the Tories. and the devastation of Scottish business, which they will be responsible for, partly through Brexit and certainly through this bill, will lie at their door. And much of it, if this bill comes in, will be felt before next May, and they will pay a very heavy price for it. None of them should be thinking that they're coming back, because most of them are not coming back.
Oliver Mundell, to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Unlike Mike Russell, I will leave it up to my voters to decide whether or not I'm coming back. Does he agree that it's a bit ironic to stand up in this Parliament and say that he's not a devolutionist this very afternoon, and at the same time tell us with a straight face that a bill which is designed to protect our United Kingdom represents the biggest threat to devolution? And has he forgotten that his party attempted to end devolution forever in 2014?
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Mundell's father and I were founding members of this Parliament. I think probably we had the same view, though not on many things. We had the same view on one thing, which was that this Parliament was an important next step for the people of Scotland. Now, some people believed that was the final step. Actually, not even the founders of devolution believed it was the final step. Donald Dewar, at the very opening, described it as a process, not an event. Maybe the Tories regarded it as the final step. But that was the agreement. That was the agreement that allowed Scotland to come together and to vote for the establishment of this party. And Mr Mundell wants to go on asking the question even when he's getting the answer. I think that's somewhat perverse, I have to say. The reality of the situation is that I believe that devolution can be built on and developed so that when the Scottish people choose to do so, they will choose independence. What I do not believe is that this Parliament should be damaged and destroyed at the whim of a government and a party it did not elect. Mr Mundell represents a part of the south of Scotland. I think he should endeavour to emulate the good folk of Dumfries, who in 1706 decided that they didn't want the Union to take place anyway. And they burnt the articles. I know Mr Smythe knows this, because I can see him acknowledging it. They burnt the articles of the Union at the cross and sent their representative to vote against the Union. Oh, if only they had a representative like that now.
Thank you very much. I call John Mason, to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary can explain to me something which I'm a little puzzled about, which is that I thought we were working on common frameworks and that there was negotiation and possibly compromise between the four governments. Can you update us on what has happened to that and why this bill is necessary?
Well, I would have to delve into the mind of Michael Gove for that, and it's not a task I would ever wish to undertake, I have to say. Because the reality of this situation is that very considerable work has gone into establishing the frameworks. We have the work completed on 7 frameworks, 6 of which apply to Scotland, but we could finish the rest of the work very quickly. And I've also said in my speech that we should be ready to commit ourselves to those frameworks even without completing that work. And as has been claimed recently by the self-same Michael Gove, the framework programme, which he thought was the bee's knees, but now apparently has things missing. If there are things missing, tell us what's missing, and we'll make sure those frameworks go into place. And it is one of the great tragedies of this, that all that work having been done, and I'm not in favour of Brexit, but we were willing to work with others to make sure that there were the frameworks in place that could provide a scaffolding to allow the countries to continue to work together. We were keen to see that happen, has been thrown away by Michael Gove. And that is a tragedy. And I would have hoped that the members of this Parliament from the Tory party would say, surely at this late stage, we can get back to discussing and putting in place the frameworks and abandon what is force majeure against not just this Parliament, but against the people of Scotland.
Fulton McGregor, to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There can be no denying that this bill is a power grab. Is the Cabinet Secretary concerned by the UK Government's plans to provide powers to UK ministers to spend directly in our devolved areas?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, if the UK Government had come along and say, here's some extra money, we'd like to spend it, how shall we spend it? We sat down with them and we said to them, well, there's this priority and that priority. Do you know that would be the mature, sensible thing to do? But for some reason, Alistair Jack, who is the Secretary of State for Scotland, in case people didn't know, Alistair Jack wants to spend money in Scotland without consulting anybody else. Now, there's a number of problems with that. The first problem is policy confusion. Say, for the sake of argument, that the Tories wish to privatise the National Health Service. Well, they do. But say, for the sake of argument, that's what they wanted to do. They could spend money. They could, under this bill, spend money on the privatisation of the health service, no matter what the Scottish Government said. But there's another problem with this too. I noticed last night there was quite a lot of tweeting being done by Douglas Ross, who, by the way, is the leader of Scottish Conservatives, in case people didn't know, by Douglas Ross and by the self-same Alistair Jack. And quite a lot of it was about the A75 and replacing it. Now, there are members in this chamber, I know, who want to see the A75 renewed. I know Emma Harper is one of them. But of course, the A75 runs through, and solely through, Presiding Officer, I won't be shouted down. I have a loud enough voice not to be shouted down. That's a lesson for the Tories. The A75 runs through entirely Tory constituencies. So what's this about? This is about spending money on their own constituencies and trying to bypass the elected representatives of the Scottish people. That will not happen. That will not happen.
Neil Finlay, to be followed by Claudia Beamish.
What an interesting afternoon, Deputy Presiding Officer. I can recall the Cabinet Secretary just mentioned that he was talking about burning documents and books. I wonder if he would like to burn copies of his past writings in Grasping the Thistle, when he advocated the privatisation of the National Health Service and the Civil Service, and advocated a new union, the Cabinet Secretary. It's my question. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary? Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if the Lord Advocate will be making a statement on the legal implications of this move by Boris Johnson's useless, incompetent and increasingly corrupt government? Dennis Skinner once said that Boris Johnson was educated beyond his intelligence. Wasn't he right about that? And isn't it a shame that there's not a single Tory has the principle or decency to stand up and condemn this utter stupidity?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I suppose it was too much to suppose I would have solidarity from Comrade Finlay. You know, at the end of the day, that was not going to happen. I really should probably just say to him in those words of a previous generation of British generals, there is the enemy, not here. Well, he doesn't seem to know that. But then let me show a generosity not shown by Comrade Finlay. The legal implications of this bill are clear. We will bring forward those legal implications at the appropriate time, and we will certainly deal with them when we deal with the legislative consent motion. Can I finally say, just as I've said to Mr Finlay on innumerable occasions in this chamber, page 5 of the introduction explains what the book was about. I am so surprised that Mr Finlay has read it all, but he has deliberately ignored page 5. He does do things in a very backward fashion.
And finally, Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that specifically in clauses 2 to 9, there is a grave risk of the baseline being far too low in view of Scotland's good environmental record, and specifically in respect to the 4 EU environmental principles, as well as the agriculture and food standards that have been highlighted by other members, that this is totally unacceptable and against our interests in terms of trade, business, and indeed in terms of human health as well? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I know that Claudia Beamish takes a particularly strong interest in these matters, and she is aware, I know, that if, for example, the Tory hostility to the Continuity Bill goes through, those environmental principles would be out the window. The Tories do not wish the bill to go through for a variety of reasons, and one of them is those environmental principles which this government is committed to. I would just take gentle disagreement with her. I don't think the baseline is too low. There isn't a baseline. I mean, what actually will take place is the moment this bill was on the statute book, the power which I referred to, which is given to the Bay's Secretary of State, to make any decisions they want, those decisions will be made. So it doesn't matter what's in the bill. It's like the illegality of the international part of it. It will all be swept away in the interests of Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party. And that is another reason why we should resist this utterly and completely. And I'm grateful for the members' support. I will call her Comrade Beamish for that.
Thank you very much. That concludes questions on the statement. We now move to the next item of business. The next item of business is indeed decision time. There is one question to be put as a result of today's business. That question is that motion 22651 in the name of Bill Kidd on the Scottish Parliament Assistance for Political Parties Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes decision time, and I therefore close this meeting.